important moment for me to understand the depths of who I was as a person, coming from a grandparent who had lived through this type of struggle.
Mm. So powerful. And so you're going to be careful not to say I can't do something anymore. And
Facts. Yeah.
adds a new meaning to the yes, we can. You kind of make that that parallel too, that there was more going on than just a political campaign with Barack Obama and this idea that, you know, we can do something, make change happen. And, you know, and I think it's also powerful that our own stories, we're all figuring it out. You know, Lisa Sharon Harper, who's dear friend, partner, been on the board of RLC for years. And she talks a lot about her own story. And, you know, I don't know if you've met her mom, but she writes about her in her, you know, book Fortune. And her mom was an organizer with, you know, Stokely Carmichael and all these like folks in Philly, and seeing those roots. And while I'm down here in Tennessee, it's kind of I've been texting Lisa saying I'm trying to dig some of my own history. So my mom took me up to the mountains where her grandmother, my grandmother was born. Her grandmother like lived in this old, like it's still a log cabin up in the hills. But I think it's a reminder for all of us to dig a little bit, right? Know our own story and grieve the parts that we need to grieve. You know, I wasn't sure if my family owned enslaved people or not. So I'm like, they were apparently really poor in the mountains. So you know, I'm still figuring all that out. But I think, you know, you write out of that context with your own family and your own experience. And this is where I want to, you know, hear a little bit more about this intersection, right? Because you talk about how these are not disconnected, like caring about unhoused people and caring about racial justice. And especially as an African-American man in America, like you even have a parallel like on page 15 where you kind of show how these things have similar shapes when it comes to the oppression, but also the fight for freedom and liberation, right?
Yeah. Yeah, intersectionality is it's one of those concepts that is important to understand, like the overlapping of the different social identities that relates to social structures of racism and oppression. Intersectionality kind of like merges many identity markers, including like race, class, gender, sexual orientation, age, ethnicity, gender, disability. And okay, so like, for example, a Black person who is unhoused might experience discrimination, not only for their housing status, but also because they are Black, right? Another layer of that could be, you could be Black and unhoused, right? And also live with a disability. That's an entirely different identity. And one of the reasons why I like use this chart within the book is to show the intersection of the parallels that one may experience if they're unhoused, you know, being criminalized for being in public space, being feared because you're unhoused, having policies written against you because you're unhoused, you know, is parallel with the experience of being Black. And there could be some intersection in between the two. You know, I've been in public spaces where I was feared because I was 6'2" and I was a Black man. You know, there are many times where there's a criminal lens of Black and brown people because, you know, of the historical imagery that has communicated this idea to be Black is to be identified as criminal. You know, to be Black also sometimes means to be, you know, feared or to be excluded. And so, like, I really wrestle with the tensions between the intersections of the two, mainly, Shane, because, you know, sociologists suggest that there are two mass homelessness eras in the United States. The one that happens during the Great Depression and the one that happens in the 70s and 80s underneath the Reagan administration. I argue, in my scholarly opinion, that there is actually three mass homelessness eras. And the first one begins when Africans were actually forced onto slave ships and made to leave their land, when indigenous folks had their land stolen from them, and that caused displacement. So I start with that framework, and then I do the progression of it, right? And help us to like really understand that during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, when most generally use this framework as the first mass homelessness era, Black people were being redlined. Yeah. This is when redlining started, you know, in the 1930s. My grandmother is 91 years old and still remembers parts of her family not able to occupy certain parts of cities when they were trying to get access to housing. So you have housing discrimination. You have, employment discrimination. The GI Bill passes in 1944, and you know who was discriminated against? Black soldiers weren't given access to adequate housing. Then you go through the civil rights era, and it's no wonder, Shane, that in 2023, Black people make up 13% of the population, but account for 50% of all of those who are unhoused in the whole United States of America. So when I look at the intersection of race and class, it's very important to me, because doing the work of being proximate to the unhoused population has given me a lens to understand how race has actually impacted the housing status of many people who are Black and brown.
Yeah, it's so good. And when we talk about, the connection between racial reconciliation and racial justice, that this is a really important connection that you make in the book. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But I was just thinking, like, when we think about systemic injustice, or the ways that, hundreds of years of racism still leaves a residue. I mean, we can see it in almost every aspect of our society. But the wild thing is, now with all the social media, you see this house, right, that had been appraised, right, when it was all white pictures on the walls, and then like an African-American family comes and it gets it's worth a whole lot less. Or I was thinking of the Freakonomics studies where they had exact resumes that were given to employers. Did you see that, where like the name on one was a white sounding name, like it was like Shannon and Shaniqua, or Matthew and Mohammed, or whatever, and over the white sounding name gets the job, even though the resumes are identical, But, this is personal too. Like I was, you make this real clear in your book that sometimes we think about these systems and structures and the redlining and the income discrepancies, the fact that white folks get stronger or less penalties for the same crime as African American, all that stuff. But then you make it so personal when you talk about when you're walking across the country and you had to use the restroom.
Oh yeah.
And I was thinking about this, man. I told my family in the car when we went up to visit that cabin way up in the mountains, my stepdad had to go to the bathroom, so we pulled off at a church. He said, "I'll just pull off at the church." And I thought that story that you tell. I mean, it's actually not funny at all, but you tell two stories of having to go to the restroom in this one church. They open the door a little bit and they're like, "Nope, sorry, you can't use our bathroom." But I mean, this
that was hurtful, man.
Yeah.
That was hurtful. I mean,
real.
In 2016, I talked to my family and my board, and at our center at Love Beyond Walls, we have a lot of people who literally walk. Tires are comparable to shoes to people who are unhoused, right? They walk for different resources, to access showers, to access sanitation, to use technology because there's a digital divide, to get access to water, right? To be in a space where they don't feel like their existence is threatening anybody around them, right? And so I asked my family and my board if I could walk across the country to raise awareness to the plight of poverty and homelessness. And so I started out from the SCLC building here in Atlanta, Georgia, partnered with Dr. Steele and Dr. Lafayette. And it took me 2 months to complete this journey. I walked through South Carolina, the northern parts of Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia. And time again, I experienced tons and tons of, racial discrimination just for simply walking. I literally had to have a press release and videos on my cell phone because people were calling the police on me because I was walking with a walking stick. I remember there were times when I would literally, I had teams with me. I would go, like this one instance, to a church. I knocked on the door in South Carolina, and I asked if I could use the restroom. People were walking in and out of the church, and the pastor and like an executive assistant looks at me through the door and says, "We can't help you." I showed them the documents. I even had a Bible with me. I said, "I'm a man of faith. This is what I'm doing to advocate on behalf of those who are unhoused." They turned me away. And I'll never forget walking off and the emotions that I felt. Here it is. I am advocating on behalf of someone that Jesus identifies with, but also being turned away. And I'll never forget that I pulled out this quote that ML King had written. He says, "Hate can't drive out hate. Darkness can't drive out darkness. You know, only love can do that." And I had this moment where I had to pause and tap into love to understand that it was love that was causing me to stay committed to this mission, even though some of the people who were discriminating against me in those communities were also impoverished, right? That's deep because I'm also walking on behalf of those who had that racial hatred in their hearts that was discriminating against me because, you know, I was staying close to what King was arguing is that love can drive out love, but it was very personal. And it's a burden that I carry every single day as a Black man.
Yeah. And, you know, as you were sharing that, you know, I thought also of remembering a story Brian Stevenson told when he showed up to court. Brian Stevenson, you know, the founder of Equal Justice Initiative. For folks, you know, listening in that don't know, he's a powerful lawyer. We went to the same school, Eastern University. He's been a friend, a part of RLC. But one of the stories he tells is when he showed up to court, right? And the judge, when he comes in the courtroom, saw him as an African-American man and said, "Sorry, you're not allowed in the courtroom yet. It's just for counsel only." And, you know, assuming he was not a lawyer. And Brian said, the irony is not only was I a lawyer, but my client was a young white man that I was, you know, arguing and defending.
Wow.
And he's got other stories that are very personal when he was sitting in his car thinking through a case and the police come up and, you know, I mean, over and over, I mean, almost everybody that's not white in America, especially African-American folks, I think have those stories. And you talk about, you know, how personal this is. And, you know, you talk about the different kinds of bias, right? So the overt bias, there's overt racism. Then there's this kind of implicit bias that we sometimes don't notice, maybe like the guy in that courtroom. But then you use this phrase inattentional blindness. And you talk about this idea, and I wanted you to unpack that a little bit, because this is probably a new idea for some folks, but it's an idea that you're building on from a couple other sociologists, right? But inattentional blindness.
Yeah. So this term, inattentional blindness, and, you know, I would even suggest that it's inattentional ignorance. It's coined by two psychologists, Arian Mack and Irvin Rock, who published, you know, this study by the same name as the actual coined phrase. So they perform all of these experiments to understand how one person or a group of people could be proximate to something without paying full attention to it, like thus rendering, you know, oneself either ignorant or blind to it, right? And the essence of this study and what they try to underscore is that, you know, it hurts everyone involved, you know, and goes against this core aspect of community when we are, you know, blind to our neighbors who may be around us or proximate to us. It's hurtful and harmful when we, you know, ignore the person who is unhoused. It's hurtful and harmful when we ignore the sufferings of those who are Black and brown, when we are like systemically oppressed by public policies and different things that harm and disrupt our communities. It's harmful when we try to ignore the history of Black people, right? By banning the books. It's almost like intentionally putting on the blinders to render oneself in this narrow-sightedness where you don't pay attention to anything or anyone else around you. And to me, Shane, that does a lot of different things. It upholds injustice. It upholds white supremacy. It keeps people ignorant, right? And on top of that, it disadvantages people from truly loving their neighbor, as Jesus said that you're supposed to love your neighbor as you love yourself. How can you love a neighbor that you're blind to? How can you love someone that you're not being proximate to? And I'm not even talking about just geographical proximity. I'm talking about cognitive proximity, because there has to be this cognition awareness that you have to really fully pay attention to those who are around you. And, I think this is the type of blindness that keeps us, from seeing our neighbors in the same ways that we want to be seen.
Yeah, I think of that King quote, right? Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Help us, Lord. Yeah, it's a good one. Hey, listen, if y'all are just tuning in, we're like monitoring the different platforms. We're all over the place. I think we're live on Facebook and Twitter and all kinds of stuff, YouTube. So if you put any questions in the chat, a few of you are on Zoom too, you can throw those there. We'll try to get to a couple of them. But this, I want to read an excerpt, Terence, of when you talk about the difference between racial justice and racial reconciliation. You say they're two distinct conversations that many white Christians conflate into one. The leap straight to racial reconciliation leaves out how a white supremacist system created the oppressive structures that disadvantage many people of color today. And just as an enslaved army cannot forgive its way out of captivity, I'm going to read that one more time, y'all. Just as an enslaved army cannot forgive its way out of captivity, a culturally oppressed people cannot forgive its way out of oppression. It must be liberated. And you go into a lot of depth about that, and you're not just discrediting the idea of reconciliation or personal forgiveness, but you're kind of
Sure
expanding that. Say a little bit more about it, man. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a distinction, right? There have been many times as a Black man who's been in ministry for a number of years, I've been invited to the conversation, right? The racial reconciliation conversations. And, if in all honesty, it's about personal or interpersonal efforts, right? To build like sort of, a sense of togetherness. It's about forgiveness, building relationships across racial lines. But where it stops, Shane, it stops there, right? And many white Christians think that racial reconciliation is it. It's the end all, right? As long as we're forgiven and we are like operating in harmony and we're together, then we're doing this world some good. And while that is true, Shane, it leaves out the racial justice issues that goes beyond personal relationships and focuses more on addressing some of the systemic and structural aspects of racism that are still upheld to this day. Racial justice seeks to rectify, unequal distribution of power, rectify, food deserts in communities that are mostly black and brown, rectify environmental racism, rectify what you stand for, right? That the abolishment of using weaponry to commit mass crimes of shootings, etc. And it deals more with the systems of oppression, and it challenges these institutional things that are upheld because of white supremacy. And you can't forgive yourself out of that. You just can't. You can't just have another, say, we're going to come together, we're going to pray, we're going to forgive. We also have to be about doing the work to stop and end some of these things that have been structurally set up that continues to perpetuate the cycles and the systems of oppression.
Yeah, and just as we think of personal salvation, there's also social transformation, right? And you pull on Dr.
Yes.
King so much in this because Dr. King knew that, right? He knew that, like, he spoke so poignantly that a law can't make someone love me, but it can make it harder for them to kill me. And we need laws to change. But no, like, you can't legislate love. You can't outlaw racism
No, you can't.
or hatred. And that's why
That's
we
right.
need both of those, right? We need the Holy Spirit, hallelujah. And we need social transformation, right? We need our laws to be more just. We need to address the history, the pain of our past. So go ahead, man. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we need both. And it has to be grounded in love, right? As a matter of fact, love should move you to want to stand in solidarity. That's what I'm arguing throughout my whole book, to open up your world to include everyone around you. It's about creating this beloved community. It's about understanding that the world is our address. And so, yeah, I totally agree. The other thing too is we also have to understand that it's a matter of the heart. I know you mentioned about the difference between de jure law or de jure law and de facto discrimination. An example of this is, the de jure law of redlining was abolished, right, with the Fair Housing Act, but it's still like being practiced in many communities. It's just not under the auspice of this actual law. But just because the law was removed does not mean that it took away the discriminatory practices and behaviors out of the hearts and minds of people. And I think what you're suggesting is that we do need that type of heart change. And it does have to start with personal salvation and commitment. And you have to be grounded in love to even want to stand in solidarity with those who you consider your neighbor.
Yeah, hallelujah. And you talk a lot about proximity, and that's something that I write a lot about, something Brian Stevenson talks a lot about, being near to those who have been most impacted by injustice, those who have experienced homelessness, those who have been wrongfully convicted or even, rightfully convicted right now, sit on death row, wondering if their life is going to be spared. But there's also, a healthy critique of proximity without authentic equality and relationship. And Dante Stewart, Howard Thurman wrote about that, right? It's not enough just to be near each other or even to rub shoulders. I mean, like, even in the middle of some of the worst eras of overt racism and lynching and Jim Crow, like, white folks and black folks were living in the same towns and stuff, but they didn't have this sense of respect and equality. And I think that's something you do a really great job at naming. And I wanted you to say a little bit more about, you've got this real, robust critique of color blindness, which you bump into in a lot of white circles, and you've been in a lot of different circles, predominantly black circles and also predominantly white circles, multicultural circles. But this idea that we just need to move on, we don't need to see color, we need to be post-race. The problem is we can't move too fast, right? Our systems and structures are still very much aware of color, and our past is very much discriminating based on color. So you want to say a little bit more about that? Because that seems like one of those ways that we can create hostile environments without recognizing it, especially in a lot of predominantly white circles, right?
Yeah.
And even quote Dr. King, as we do it.
Yeah. I mean, brother, I can't begin to even count the number of times when I've been in white spaces, both Christian and non-Christian, and I've heard white people say to me, I don't see color. And I've sat there with all of the emotions that my grandfather carried in the conversations we've had. I've sat there with all of the emotions that my grandmother carried in the conversations that we had. And I'm talking about like grandparents who are still alive. And so I'll never forget this one instance where our organization was invited to be a part of like this huge corporate event. It was predominantly white, and I was the only Black leader that's leading the organization that's there, right? And afterwards, there was a group of white men standing around. One of them actually said that they didn't see color, right, to me, and they were happy that I was there, right? And so they're packing up these resources, and this middle-aged white woman walks over to me, right, and she asked me where were the trash bags because she thought I was the janitor.
Sweet Lord Jesus.
A lady runs over, notices this happening, explains to her, like, I was an organization being represented, etc. And the lady sheds tears, apologizes, walks over to a corner, and just kind of like processes what happens. Color blindness to me is an intentional, it's a willful ignorance, right? Where you willfully ignore the fact that someone of color, a Black person, a brown person, is, systematically discriminated against. And when you say you don't see color, what I hear is you don't see me. You don't see what my grandparents went through. You don't see some of the systemic things that are still plaguing Black and brown communities. You don't see the impoverishment. You don't see the homelessness. You don't see the ways in which Black people are still fighting to not only be equal, but to have equity and to have this sense of belonging. And so colorblindness to me is, man, it's a willful ignorance where you willfully ignore how skin color actually plays a role in some of the things that happen to discriminate against Black people.
Yeah, it's such a good word. And I've often built on a lot of other scholarship when it comes to the contrast between the Tower of Babel story and Pentecost, where it was the Tower of Babel was monoculture, one language, one people impressed by themselves, and God scatters them and creates culture and language. And then in Pentecost, there's this really brilliant diversity and the unity. So it's, unity is not about uniformity. It's oneness isn't about sameness, but you think of a symphony, right? It's beautiful because it's diverse. And I even think of this, every person having a unique fingerprint and DNA, and even Pride Month, when people are remembering the colors, we're remembering that God is an artist, and that's a beautiful thing. So,
yes,
thank you for your work on that, man. So we're looking at.
I mean, it's important.
Go ahead, man. Yeah, go ahead.
It's important.
Yeah.
If I hope that white Christians who may hear this understand that when they are saying they love their neighbor, that is not a monolithic statement. It's not a single focus statement where like I love my neighbor in passing. No, I love my neighbor and their origins. I love my neighbor and their historical shaping. I love my neighbor and their social location. I love my neighbor and all of the existential experiences that informs who they are. But not only that, I'm loving the neighborhood where the neighbor emerges from, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
It's going a little bit deeper. I'm understanding that love for neighborhood to understand how it's been historically impacted. I'm understanding the challenges that the neighborhood faces. And because I'm proximate to my neighbor, that causes me to want to lament with my neighbor, learn from my neighbor, stand in solidarity with my neighbor, use my voice to advocate with my neighbor. And it's just that level of depth that we need when we say that we're following Jesus, right?
Yeah. If one part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts. If one part of the body rejoices, we all rejoice. And
that's right.
I think of that's why it's so important to be able to be particular about God's love, and God giving special honor to the parts of our family that have been dishonored. And I think that's also why it's so important to be able to say Black Lives Matter, because history has said Black lives don't matter, at least not as much as white folks. And so, the Dred Scott case to the Three-Fifths Compromise, I mean, all through it, we got this idea that some lives matter more than others. So it's beautiful to be able to say that Black lives matter. And you can't say all lives matter until you really believe in the specificity of God's love. So let's talk a little bit about, it's almost July 4th, man. And we got flags waving, and you've got this beautiful part. I mean, it's heavy. And I just wrote this book, Rethinking Life, where I've been doing some of the hard work of telling the true story of America, not just the mythology of America. I talk about Abraham Lincoln, and some of Christopher Columbus, these people we've had holidays after. But you bring this whole thing. I mean, you kind of paint this picture in a powerful way that 40 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. But you also talk about the national anthem and
Francis Scott Key.
Yeah, man, get into it. So I'll just read this part that you quote from the National Museum of American History. And this is Francis Scott Key, who wrote the national anthem. And it says, when he wrote that poem, that would in 1931 become the national anthem and proclaim our nation the land of the free, like Jefferson, Key not only profited from slaves, he harbored racist conceptions of American citizenship and human potential. Africans in America, he said, were, and this is a quote, a distinct and inferior race of people, which all experience proves to be the greatest evil that afflicts a community. I mean, it makes me sick at my stomach, as I read those words of Francis Scott Key. And so you want to talk a little bit more about, as we think towards the 4th of July, how we can have an appropriate orientation to America, especially as, folks who have a deeper allegiance to Christ than to America. Not everybody listening is a Christian, maybe, but I think those of us who are, that should reshape things. And especially our history of white supremacy should shape some of how we even hear the national anthem, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back and do, some context to the entirety of what was written, I mean, there's a third verse that is oftentimes omitted that says, no refuge get saved, the hurling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. Who is Key talking about in that verse? He's talking about enslaved Africans. He's talking about people who were forced on ships, who lost their lives during the Middle Passage, forced to come here against their will, made to be property. He's viewing Africans who were enslaved through this lens. And this is the context of our national anthem. So when Black people saw Colin kneeling in protest to police brutality, and we saw all of the backlash and the attacks and, trying to disgrace him. And when he was trying to make this statement that we need to pay attention to the injustices that were done, let me ask you, Shane, what did white Christian nationalists do?
Yeah.
What did they do? They attacked verbally. They used, a reframing. They said that, he was ungrateful, that he stood against, America, right? All of these types of...
now you got the whole bumper stickers and T-shirts and the whole movement, stand for the flag,
all
for
this
the
movement.
cross. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, we need to push back against this. You made a statement in your notes. You said that you didn't believe that we should sing the national anthem. Let me ask you why.
Well, For me, nationalism and patriotism even is it shrinks our love rather than expanding it. So, I mean, Jesus is just so radical in how he redefines family. I mean, and literally, we've made it cliche, but in the evangelical world, we talk about being born again. And that means, you know, I mean, even Jesus said it. I mean, it couldn't be more clear when his actual mother, biological mother and brothers come and they say, hey, your family's here. Jesus says, who's my family? Who are my mother and brothers? It's bigger than that, y'all. Like, and so that's, you know, how I think of it is Mother Teresa said,
Yes.
sometimes the circle we've drawn around our family is just too small. And that's why Jesus's words for family are radical. You've got to love bigger than your own biological family. You've got to love bigger than your own nationality. I mean, a love for our own people's
That's right.
not a bad thing, but like we've got an allegiance that's bigger than nationalism. And I think that's the real danger, right? As we begin to think it matters more if someone here inside our border is hurting than on the other side of a wall or the border. And I think that's a theological heresy.
Yes. There's a quote.
We're getting into it tonight, y'all. We're getting into it tonight.
Yeah. There's a quote. So this is from Dr. King in this book, Where do we go from here? He says, we've inherited a large house, a great world house, in which we have to live together, Black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu, a family unduly separated in ideas, culture, and interests, who, because we can never again live apart, must somehow learn to live with each other in peace, right?
Yes.
He's talking about this idea of interconnectedness, interdependentness.
Yes.
He's talking about what you're saying, that we should have this love that is greater than division, greater than nationality, greater than this ideology that seeks to uphold that some are accepted while others are excluded. This ideology that, you know, accepts that some belong and others should be marginalized. That's the type of love that we should ground ourselves in. And then he goes on to say that we need to have a love greater than our tribe, than our creed,
yes.
than our ideologies that seeks to divide us. That's King at his best.
Yeah.
You know,
the Bible doesn't say God so loved America, but God so loved the world, y'all. God so loved the world. And so I'll say this. I don't know if you got an idea for the 4th of July, but I'd say this is just a few years ago, y'all, maybe even last year. We've done it a couple of times. We did the entire reading of Frederick Douglass's speech, iconic speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. And so you can listen to that if you just want to sit back and listen. Like we each took a paragraph and we read the whole thing in its entirety, but at least read that speech. I think that would be a powerful way to think about the 4th of July this year, maybe even annually, to honor him and his words. But I got 2 questions left. You got anything else to say about that though, man? I'll just say one more thing too. In Philly, it's ironic that fireworks are illegal because people think they're dangerous, but AK-47s and AR-15s are still legal. So we got some things we're working on.
Wow.
You got any things that you want to share on? I got 2 more questions. One of them's from somebody on the web, but I didn't want to cut you off, man.
Yeah, one of the things that I do with my children, I definitely read Frederick Douglass with them. But one of the things that we have done is just like we find actual facts about Black history. We discuss them. We talk about 4th of July through the lens of those who were enslaved, because you do know that Africans were still enslaved. I mean, we just celebrated Juneteenth. We even discussed the depths of that. We discussed, what the ratification meant a few years later that put that clause in there that still allots for enslavement of those who found themselves in the the prison system. And so, I just try to talk to them about like a lot of historical things, but greater than that, I try to like celebrate and just have joy just with my family, right? Because Black joy is a form of resistance against any type of oppressive system. I think that has been something that has been a saving grace for me and my faith, right? Knowing that God loves me, loves our history, loves everything about my family. And we get a chance to celebrate that in a way that's really healthy, that centers our narrative.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the last things I wanted to hear from you. And was I think we're all have to be very intentional, as Brian Stevenson says, to protect our joy, right? And as that old song goes, this joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me and the world can't take it away. So we can't let the principalities and powers rob us of our joy. But that's a discipline, and I know some of the things that I do, but I'd love to hear some of the sort of holy habits or spiritual disciplines you have for protecting your joy and keeping your hope alive. You got any thoughts on that as we sort of wrap up?
Yeah. I mean, I do a number of things. I do readings with my family. Sometimes we get together and we read, things, and we discuss what they mean to us. Even our children sometimes will bring things, even if they're from a children's book. We discuss them at greater depth. We love to laugh and do fun activities like fishing and travel and exercise. But our family, we love to worship together. Sometimes we sit in silence and we listen to worship music, and we just allow the worship of God within itself, give us that inspiration and that feeling that we need to be whole, to feel whole. And then there are times, man, where we just go and connect with community members, right? And when I say community members, I'm talking about our friends in community who are just overlooked, man. Like, I think it's very spiritual to be in proximity and to listen to the stories of people, the people that society may say are undeserving or unworthy. To us, conversations with our community members has given us inspiration. We get a chance to weep with people, to laugh with people, to dream with people, right? Because suffering can be transitional. It doesn't have to be something that defines a person's entire life, right? And so, just being in close proximity to community members and seeing faces is a beautiful way to engage in something that is uplifting for us personally.
I think it's such a good word, even in the movement too, like around all of these different intersecting, interlocking injustices. We need that joy, and it's every movement that's changed the world has had joy and celebration and art and music at the heart of it. And I was even thinking of our friends down there in Atlanta. I don't know if you are a part of all this, but this is, I might show my age a little bit, man. We're getting ready to celebrate 25 years in Philly of the community. And in the early days, there were folks in Atlanta down there that a lot of folks on the street were getting written up for using the restroom in public. And they would even get charged with sex offenses, right? Because they couldn't find a toilet. And so there was a whole movement there called Pee for Free with Dignity. they marched with toilets.
I don't think I know that one.
They carried toilets and laid them at City Hall and said, we got to have some bathrooms up in here. You can't be locking up people if we don't have public restrooms. So, but that joy, man, we got to keep it alive. And I want to give you the last word, or invite you, if you want to send us out with a prayer benediction or any last words, man. This hour has been a gift. And thanks for listening in, everybody. If you don't have the book yet, grab it. And Dr. Lester's written other books too, but this is the new one, All God's Children. how confronting buried history can build racial solidarity. So grab this, hand it out. This is a gift to the church, my brother, and a gift to the world, just like you are. So send this out, man. You got any closing words or benediction or anything?
Yeah. You know what I've been thinking a lot about lately?
Tell me.
That it's okay to contribute whatever you have.
Mm.
And the reason why, Shane, is because we live in a digital age. At any given moment, you can pick up a cell phone and be bombarded with all sorts of injustices all around the world all at once. And sometimes that creates some sort of like stuckness, right? Or paralyzation. What can I contribute is the question that people wrestle with. How can I be a part of seeing something change? Well, what I found out is that any piece, no matter how big or small, it's all about contributing what you have to the collective fabric of social change, to the collective fabric of the love of God and what God is doing yet still. And, I think, just I would say if you're in a place right now and you don't know where to start, what to start with, or you've been exhausted by what you have been doing, pause, breathe, and then look at what you have before you and see it as something as, special to contribute to what God is doing in the earth. Because what you give and what I give and what Shane gives and what everybody else gives has the potential to create some type of change.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Thank you, brother. What a gift this hour has been. And y'all tell folks how they can follow you, Terence, on socials and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. You can follow me at I'm Terence Lester. That's IMTERENCELESTER. Shane, it's been a pleasure, man. I'm deeply inspired by you, and I thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you, brother. We'll keep in touch. We'll see more of you. I hope to see you soon. And thanks, everybody, for joining us. Remember, next month is Jamar Tisby's book, How to Fight Racism. Grab it now. We'll have Jamar on here July 23rd. And join us July 1st for morning prayer. And we'll be joined by folks at Supreme Court working for the end of the death penalty. Love y'all. Love you, brother. And we'll see you soon.
I love you too, man.